My wife asked for a divorce. She sat across from me in a freezing conference room and said she wanted the estate, the cars, and the commercial properties. She wanted everything except our son. My lawyer begged me to fight her. I looked at him and said to give it all to her. Everyone in that room thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed everything over with a steady hand. She smiled, thinking she had ruined me. She did not know I had already won. Her victory lasted exactly until her lawyer read the final page, lost all color in his face, and whispered 5 words that destroyed her life. "You just assumed the debt." My name is Eugene. I am 70 years old, and I spent 4 decades building a logistics empire from absolutely nothing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who completely underestimated your worth. The air in the downtown law firm conference room felt unnaturally cold, chilling the tension that hung between us. The heavy mahogany table separating us felt like a barren battlefield. Brenda slid the thick divorce settlement across the polished wood with a deliberate, aggressive push. Her manicured fingers tapped against the crisp white paper, an impatient rhythm demanding my total surrender. She demanded the primary estate in the gated community, a home I purchased outright 2 decades ago. She demanded the entire fleet of luxury vehicles, including the vintage sedans she never drove. She explicitly demanded the commercial real estate portfolio I had painstakingly acquired over the last 10 years. She laid out her terms with cold, calculated precision. Her eyes fixed on mine, searching for a reaction, hoping to see the pain of a man losing his life's work. I gave her nothing. For 40 years, I had provided her with a life of absolute luxury. I shielded her from the brutal, exhausting realities of the logistics business. Now she was using the very financial security I built to strip me down to the studs. Her lawyer, a young man in a sharp suit who looked like he had never lifted anything heavier than a fountain pen, pushed the settlement agreement closer to my side of the table. He recited the asset division aloud, listing properties and bank accounts that represented my literal blood and sweat. Brenda sat perfectly straight, her chin raised, radiating a suffocating entitlement. She wanted to erase me from the wealth I had created and leave me with scraps. Brenda pointed a sharp acrylic nail at the last section of the asset division, tapping the paper hard. She stated clearly and loudly that she wanted absolutely nothing to do with Aaron. Our 35-year-old son had run his medical supply company straight into the ground through sheer incompetence. She demanded that I take sole responsibility for his failing business and all of his financial missteps. She called his company a sinking ship and flatly refused to let it drag her down with him. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. My knuckles were thick-scarred and permanently calloused. Long before the tailored suits and the boardrooms, I built my logistics empire by loading freight trucks on night shifts. I spent 15 years breathing diesel fumes, organizing dispatch routes at 3 in the morning, and sleeping in the cramped cab of an 18-wheeler. While I was pulling double shifts to keep our fledgling company afloat, Brenda was attending country club luncheons. She spent her afternoons organizing high society charity galas, and her evenings complaining that I worked too much. I never threw her lack of contribution in her face. I carried the heavy weight, because that was my duty as a man and a provider. I poured the concrete foundation she danced upon. Now she was looking at me with undisguised contempt, treating the son we raised together like a toxic asset she needed to quickly discard. I did not say any of this aloud. I did not raise my voice or defend my legacy to a woman who fundamentally despised me. I simply reached across the mahogany table and picked up the heavy silver pen. Simon leaned forward, abruptly slamming his hand over the documents to physically stop me. My lawyer had been by my side for 20 years. He knew exactly what it took to build the commercial portfolio Brenda was trying to steal. He vehemently objected, his voice rising in the quiet room, breaking the sterile professionalism. He listed the decades of my labor, the physical sacrifices, and the ironclad legal precedents we could use to destroy her demands in open court. He begged me to let him fight. He promised that no judge in the state would allow a woman who never worked a single day in the business to walk away with the entire commercial empire. I looked at Simon and calmly pulled the documents out from under his hand. I ignored his desperate, impassioned legal advice. I clicked the silver pen and began to sign my name. I signed away the sprawling estate with the custom pool. I signed away the luxury cars she paraded around town. I signed away the highly lucrative commercial real estate portfolio. I signed page after page, initialing every aggressive demand with entirely steady hands. I did not hesitate or flinch. Brenda watched me with a victorious smirk spreading across her face. She adjusted her designer coat, letting out a soft sigh of ultimate satisfaction. She looked at her lawyer, sharing a triumphant glance that communicated her absolute victory. She genuinely believed she had outsmarted a man who had navigated cutthroat industry negotiations for 40 years. She assumed my silence was a total surrender. She assumed my quick signature was the desperate action of an old, exhausted man who no longer had the strength to fight a vicious legal battle. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. Brenda reached out greedily to pull the signed documents back across the table. Her lawyer picked up the final appendix to verify my signatures and secure their win. As his eyes scanned the bottom paragraph, the smug confidence vanished completely from his face. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly pale. His hands began to tremble violently, causing the thick paper to rustle loudly in the silent room. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically over the legal jargon I had carefully instructed Simon to embed in the property transfer clauses months ago. Brenda noticed his sudden, visible panic. She frowned deeply, her voice sharp as she demanded to know what was wrong with the paperwork. The young lawyer leaned in close to her, physically shrinking in his chair. He did not dare to look at me. He stared directly at the floor and whispered 5 devastating words into Brenda's ear. "You just assumed the debt." The victorious smirk instantly melted off Brenda's face. Her eyes snapped to mine wide and filled with sudden blinding terror as the realization hit her. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to demand I tear up the papers, but no sound came out. I placed the silver pen back onto the mahogany table. I stood up calmly, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked out the door without looking back. The cheap deadbolt on my apartment door offered zero resistance when Brenda kicked it open. She marched into the cramped living room, her designer heels clicking harshly against the scuffed linoleum floor. She looked entirely out of place in this working-class neighborhood, a woman draped in silk and entitlement, invading a space built for wage workers. I sat in a folding metal chair, drinking black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. Brenda did not waste time with greetings. She slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the flimsy plastic folding table I was using as a desk. The impact rattled my coffee cup. Her face was flushed, contorted into a mask of pure rage. She screamed that her new financial advisors had just reviewed the commercial real estate portfolio. The pristine warehouse district she fought so viciously to take from me was not generating the clean revenue she expected. Instead, it was completely anchored to a massive impending federal tax balloon payment. She pointed a trembling finger at my face, accusing me of hiding the truth during the mediation. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked at the documents she had thrown on the table. They were the exact same papers she had smugly signed less than 48 hours ago. I did not hide anything from her. Her lawyers simply lacked the industrial competence to read beyond the gross valuation. They saw $30 million in commercial property and stopped reading. They completely missed the operational tax deferments I had legally structured into those specific lots. Brenda demanded I call my legal team and reverse the transfer immediately. She ordered me to take the properties back and give her the cash equivalent instead. I set my coffee mug down exactly in the center of the plastic table. I looked directly into her furious eyes and spoke with absolute, flat precision. I explained that I could not take the properties back even if I wanted to. I had legally stepped down as the chief executive officer of the primary holding company exactly 6 months ago. The moment she filed the initial divorce papers and declared her intent to strip my assets, I restructured the logistics empire. I systematically isolated the heaviest corporate liabilities, the deferred federal maintenance taxes, and the environmental compliance debts. I attached those exact liabilities directly to the specific commercial properties she was aggressively demanding in the settlement. I used the very greed she operated on to build a perfect financial cage. She assumed I was fighting to keep those warehouses because they were the crown jewel of my life's work. I fought for them in mediation specifically so she would demand them harder. I legally consolidated the toxic debt into the exact assets she successfully stripped from me. I reminded her of the brutal negotiation tactics she used last week. She had explicitly rejected any shared corporate oversight. She demanded total unencumbered ownership of the commercial real estate. By demanding total ownership, she legally absorbed total liability. I operated completely within the boundaries of the law. I submitted every financial ledger during discovery. Her attorneys simply failed to understand corporate logistics. They treated a massive freight distribution network like a simple residential house flip. I told her she was no longer a country club socialite riding on the coattails of a logistics magnate. She was now the sole proprietor of a heavily indebted industrial portfolio. For 40 years, I managed the crushing weight of federal compliance while she hosted galas. I shielded her from the brutal reality of running a transportation empire. She mistook my protection for simplicity. She mistook my quiet endurance for weakness. Now she was holding the raw, unfiltered reality of the business she thought she could effortlessly steal. The debt was hers, irrevocably and entirely. Brenda stared at me, the aggressive posture slowly draining from her shoulders. I outlined the exact unyielding reality of her new financial position. She owned the buildings. The deed was in her name. Therefore, she owed the federal government $2 million payable in full by the last business day of the current month. If she failed to pay, the Internal Revenue Service would not send a polite reminder. They would immediately initiate federal asset seizure protocols. I listed her current liquid assets from memory. The divorce settlement awarded her the primary estate, the luxury vehicle fleet, and the commercial buildings. She had deliberately left the liquid cash accounts to me, assuming she could instantly sell the real estate or collect massive rent checks. I informed her that the commercial tenants had long-term leases with locked rates that barely covered basic operational overhead. She had absolutely no liquid cash to pay a $2 million federal tax bill. She could not sell the commercial properties because no legitimate buyer would purchase industrial real estate with an active impending federal lien attached to the title. She was cash poor and asset-heavy in a toxic market. She was entirely trapped in a cage made of her own profound greed. I watched her process the mathematics. The color drained from her face as the cold logic dismantled her arrogant illusions. She gripped the edge of the plastic table, her knuckles turning white. She demanded to know how she was supposed to survive this. I told her that was no longer my concern. My legal obligations to her ended the moment the judge struck his gavel. She had asked for the crown, and I handed it to her. I advised her to figure out how to carry its weight. Brenda began to pace the small room, her breathing shallow and erratic. She looked at the cheap walls, the bare light bulb overhead, trying to understand how the man she discarded had engineered her ruin from a folding chair. She stopped pacing and glared at me, her vanity attempting a desperate resurrection. Brenda crossed her arms, her ego surging in a final display of defiance. She declared she would simply sell the primary estate. The mansion in the gated community was appraised at over $3 million. She spat the words at me, stating she would list the house with her luxury broker this afternoon, pay off the pathetic tax bill, and still walk away with a fortune. She snatched her designer purse off the table, promised I would die in this miserable apartment, and marched out the door, slamming it so hard the flimsy frame rattled. I did not move until I heard her car engine start and fade down the street. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed Gregory, my forensic accountant. He answered on the first ring. I told him Brenda was heading to her broker to list the primary estate. I instructed Gregory to contact the county clerk and monitor the title search query. I told him to prepare the financial documentation regarding Aaron's offshore activities. The trap I laid 2 years ago was about to snap shut. Brenda thought she owned a free and clear asset. She thought her only problem was a commercial tax bill. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her beloved son had been using that exact same house as a personal bank. I hung up the phone and poured myself another cup of black coffee. The board was set. Brenda was about to discover exactly what our son had been doing in the dark. Gregory tracked the digital footprint of the title query the exact second the luxury real estate broker initiated the search. Brenda sat in a plush leather chair inside a high-end brokerage firm downtown. She crossed her legs expecting a seamless transaction. She demanded an expedited listing for the primary estate, pricing the mansion at a heavily inflated $3.5 million. She wanted an immediate cash buyer to liquidate the asset and cover her newly acquired $2 million federal tax burden. She smiled, assuming the walls of the gated community were her ultimate salvation. The broker typed the property address into the county registry database. He hit enter. The forced polite smile vanished entirely from his face. He stared at his computer monitor. He refreshed the page, assuming a digital error. The data remained exactly the same. He slowly printed the report, the machine grinding loudly in the quiet office. He did not offer Brenda a glass of sparkling water. He slid the single sheet of paper across the glass desk. He looked at her with a mixture of professional pity and severe caution. He informed her that the primary estate could not be legally sold, transferred, or liquidated under any circumstances. Brenda demanded an explanation, her voice pitching high with sudden indignation. She insisted she owned the house free and clear, citing the divorce decree she had practically extorted from me. The broker shook his head. He tapped a manicured finger against the bottom half of the printed page. He pointed to a massive red flag on the title. The property was heavily encumbered by multiple secondary mortgages. The estate was locked down by massive, unyielding financial liens. Brenda stared at the paper, entirely unable to comprehend the mathematics of her sudden ruin. Brenda snatched the paper from the desk. She read the figures, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. There were 3 distinct commercial loans anchored directly to the deed of the house. The total debt equaled the entire market value of the property. She slammed her hand on the glass, shouting that I must have secretly mortgaged the house out of spite. The broker calmly pulled up the digital scanned signatures for the loan originations. He turned his monitor around so Brenda could see the glaring truth. The authorization signatures did not belong to me. The name inked on the bottom line of the multi-million-dollar collateral agreements was Aaron. Brenda froze. She stared at the screen, her mind violently rejecting the visual evidence. The broker meticulously explained the timeline. Exactly 2 years ago, Aaron secured a comprehensive power of attorney. He presented this document to a predatory private lending firm. He utilized the primary estate as collateral to secure high-risk, exorbitant loans to funnel directly into his failing medical supply business. Brenda argued that Aaron had no legal ownership of the house to leverage. The broker pulled up the second document. It was the power of attorney. It bore my exact signature, perfectly replicated at the bottom of the page. It was a flawless forgery executed by my own son. Brenda felt the room spin. The reality of the betrayal hit her like a physical blow. During the divorce mediation, she had aggressively protected Aaron. She had demanded I take full ownership of his sinking company to shield him from bankruptcy. She had fought to keep the mansion as her personal sanctuary. She now realized the son she protected had secretly gutted her sanctuary to keep his own miserable ambitions afloat. Aaron had cannibalized his own mother's inheritance 2 years before the divorce even began. Brenda clutched her designer purse, the leather creaking under her grip. Her golden child was not a victim of my tough parenting. He was a parasite, a fraud, and a thief. Brenda stormed out of the brokerage firm and drove recklessly to Aaron's upscale subdivision. She bypassed the intercom, punched in the security code she knew by heart, and marched straight through the front door. She found Aaron sitting at his expansive kitchen island, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. She hurled the printed title report directly at his chest. The paper scattered across the quartz countertop. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could forge my signature and secretly mortgage the home she just bled me dry to acquire. Aaron did not flinch. He did not drop to his knees and beg for forgiveness. He casually pushed the papers aside. He looked at his mother with a cold, unapologetic arrogance. He shifted the blame instantly, utilizing the exact same victim mentality Brenda had nurtured in him for 3 decades. Aaron claimed I starved him of necessary operational capital. He stated that I forced him to seek alternative, aggressive funding because I refused to inject more of my own cash into his sinking medical supply business. He justified the forgery as a necessary corporate pivot. Brenda stood paralyzed by his absolute lack of remorse. Before she could slap him, Megan walked into the kitchen. Aaron's wife wore premium athletic gear and carried a glass of sparkling water. She did not offer Brenda a greeting. Megan stepped deliberately between Brenda and Aaron, crossing her arms. She looked at her mother-in-law with absolute unfiltered disdain. Megan defended the forgery without hesitation. She told Brenda to stop acting hysterical over a simple business maneuver. Megan then launched a vicious attack, blaming Brenda for the entire situation. She stated that if Brenda had been a better mother, she would have forced me to hand over the family wealth to Aaron years ago. Megan declared Brenda was useless, weak, and entirely responsible for the financial mess they were currently sitting in. The familial alliance completely shattered in a matter of seconds. Megan took total control of the room, utilizing the sheer force of her entitlement. She commanded Brenda to stop crying and start thinking strategically. Megan outlined her aggressive plan with chilling efficiency. She knew exactly where the real money resided. She knew I still held multiple liquid private retirement accounts untouched by the divorce settlement, because Brenda had focused exclusively on the physical real estate. Megan declared they would simply force me to liquidate my private funds to pay off Aaron's fraudulent loans and clear the massive liens on Brenda's new house. Brenda asked how they could possibly force me to surrender my protected assets. Megan laughed, a sharp, cruel sound echoing off the high ceilings. She stated that I was an old man who cared deeply about his pristine reputation in the local community. She promised to extract the capital from me using methods Brenda was too cowardly to employ. Megan grabbed her designer handbag and her luxury car keys off the kitchen counter. She instructed Aaron to stay put and let her handle the logistics of blackmail. Megan marched out the front door, entirely confident in her ability to break a man she fundamentally underestimated. She got into her car, completely unaware that she was driving directly into the steel jaws of a trap I had prepared long before she even knew she was playing the game. A sharp, rapid knocking on my apartment door broke the quiet of my morning. I opened it to find Megan standing in the hallway, wearing premium athletic gear that cost more than a month of groceries for an average working family. She pushed past me without an invitation and stepped directly into the small living room. Her eyes scanned the modest space with absolute revulsion. I offered her a seat on the gray microfiber sofa. She looked at the fabric, visibly recoiled, and chose to remain standing. She preferred to tower over the cheap furniture to establish her perceived dominance. She did not waste time with pleasantries or fake family warmth. Megan immediately demanded that I liquidate my private retirement accounts. She had done her research and knew these accounts were strictly protected during the divorce proceedings, completely isolated from Brenda's aggressive reach. She laid out her ultimatum with the cold entitlement of a woman who had never earned a single dollar of her own wealth. She stated that I needed to wire the cash directly to Aaron's medical supply company to salvage his sinking business from total collapse. Furthermore, she demanded I pay off the $2 million tax lien currently suffocating Brenda's commercial properties and clear the fraudulent mortgages Aaron had secretly taken out against the primary estate. She spoke as if she were ordering a meal at a luxury restaurant, entirely expecting me to serve her without question. I stood near the kitchen counter and watched her perform. She genuinely believed that because I had walked away from the primary estate and the holding company, I was weak, defeated, and willing to be bled dry. She demanded I initiate the wire transfers by the end of the business day to avoid severe, unrecoverable consequences for my own personal legacy. I asked her what specific consequences she was referring to. Megan smiled a sharp and predatory expression that revealed the true depth of her malice. She stepped closer, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She informed me that she had already drafted a comprehensive, highly damaging statement for the local press and several influential community boards. She told me she planned to publicly claim that I had severely physically and emotionally abused Aaron throughout his entire childhood. She detailed the fabricated allegations with terrifying, calculated precision. She was prepared to tell the world that my massive success in the logistics industry was fueled by an explosive, violent temper that I took out on my only son behind the closed iron gates of our mansion. I served on the board of 3 major charities and fully funded the community youth center downtown. My reputation in the city was immaculate, built on 40 years of quiet philanthropy and ethical business practices. Megan knew exactly how valuable my reputation was to me. She intended to completely obliterate my name. She promised to launch a relentless media campaign that would force the charities to sever ties with me, ruin my standing among my peers, and ensure I spent my final years as an isolated social pariah. She stated that a wealthy, powerful black man abusing his helpless son was exactly the kind of scandalous, destructive headline the local media would devour without ever asking for actual proof. She offered to permanently bury the statement and sign a non-disclosure agreement if I transferred the required millions to Aaron's accounts by sunset. She called it a simple business transaction. She equated the total destruction of my life's work with a minor public relations fee. She stood in my living room, absolutely convinced she had backed a billionaire into a corner from which he could not possibly escape. I did not react to her threats. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer a frantic defense against her fabricated accusations. I maintained complete and absolute silence. The sudden, heavy lack of response unsettled her. Her predatory smile faltered as she waited for me to beg, argue, or desperately negotiate for my reputation. I simply turned my back on her and walked into the small kitchen. I took my time. I reached into the upper cabinet, retrieved a heavy ceramic mug, and poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee from the machine on the counter. The sound of the dark liquid filling the mug was the only noise in the apartment. Megan shifted her weight impatiently, the rubber soles of her expensive sneakers squeaking sharply against the linoleum floor. She demanded to know if I was listening to her. She raised her voice, attempting to reclaim the aggressive authority she felt slipping away in the quiet room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot coffee, savoring the bitter taste. I walked back into the living room and stood directly in front of her. I did not look at her face. Instead, I raised my right hand and pointed a single finger toward the top shelf of the cheap particle board bookcase situated directly behind her left shoulder. Megan stopped speaking instantly. She turned her head slowly to follow my gesture. Nestled between 2 thick, hardcover books on corporate tax law was a small black, high-definition security camera. A tiny red LED light blinked rhythmically on the front of the glossy lens. The lens was pointed directly at where she was standing. I watched the devastating realization crash into her nervous system. The camera was not hidden. It was sitting in plain sight, actively recording every single word she had spoken since she barged through my front door. I finally broke my silence. I informed Megan that the device was actively uploading high-definition video and crystal-clear audio to an encrypted cloud server managed directly by my legal team. I explained that she had just spent the last 10 minutes detailing a premeditated, highly illegal extortion plot. I recited the exact state and federal penal codes regarding extortion, blackmail, and the intent to distribute defamatory material for financial gain. I told her that threatening to destroy a private citizen's reputation with fabricated abuse claims in exchange for a multi-million-dollar payout, was a severe federal felony. I assured her it carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The color vanished from Megan's face entirely. She looked back at the blinking red light, her chest heaving, as true unfiltered panic seized her. She had marched into my home to secure a massive financial lifeline for her husband, and had instead handed me the ultimate legal weapon to destroy her own freedom. I advised her to leave my property immediately, before I called the police to have her arrested for trespassing and attempted extortion. Megan did not say another word. She grabbed her designer handbag, turned on her heel, and practically ran to the front door. She yanked it open and fled down the hallway, leaving the door wide open in her frantic, terrified escape. I walked over and pushed the door shut, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying click. The board was perfectly arranged. They were completely out of options, and their escalating desperation was about to force them into a spectacular legal trap they could never undo. The failure of Megan's extortion plot sent a shockwave of absolute panic through their ranks. The next morning, Brenda, Aaron, and Megan convened in the expansive, heavily mortgaged living room of the primary estate. The volatile alliance was born purely out of shared desperation and impending financial ruin. They abandoned their bitter infighting, realizing their mutual survival depended entirely on dismantling the legal barricades I had constructed around my assets. They knew they could not legally challenge the corporate restructuring or the signed divorce decree through standard arbitration. They needed a weapon capable of completely invalidating every signature I had ever provided and every recording I had ever captured. Megan, operating with her usual vicious efficiency, proposed the ultimate solution. She suggested they file an emergency ex parte court petition to officially declare me mentally incompetent. She reasoned that if they could convince a judge I was suffering from advanced dementia, they could legally void the divorce settlement, nullify the property transfers, and dismiss the extortion recordings as the paranoid delusions of a declining mind. They pooled the last remaining dregs of Aaron's business credit to hire a notoriously corrupt local psychiatrist. This doctor specialized in providing expedited, highly favorable medical evaluations for wealthy families engaged in cutthroat probate disputes. The plan was aggressive, highly illegal, and completely reliant on the assumption that an old man living in a sparse apartment would be easily intimidated by aggressive medical authority. They intended to ambush me, force a rapid evaluation, and secure the diagnosis necessary to seize total control of my life. They arrived at my apartment building precisely at 2 p.m, bypassing the buzzer and slipping through the security door behind a delivery driver. They did not knock politely. Aaron pounded his fist against the cheap wood of my door, demanding immediate entry. I opened the door to find the three of them standing shoulder to shoulder, flanked by a tall, sharply dressed man clutching a thick leather briefcase. The man introduced himself as Dr. Aris Thorne. He did not offer his hand or produce proper identification. He simply stated that he was court-appointed to conduct an immediate mandatory psychiatric evaluation. He pushed past me, stepping into the small living room with the arrogant assumption of total authority. Brenda followed him, her eyes darting around the modest space with poorly disguised contempt. Megan and Aaron brought up the rear, standing by the door like hired muscle to block any escape. They expected me to panic. They expected me to yell, to demand they leave, or to refuse the evaluation entirely, thereby providing them with the exact erratic behavior they needed to fuel their incompetency petition. I did not give them a single reaction to weaponize. I remained completely calm, my face a blank mask of polite indifference. I stepped aside and gestured toward the small dining area. I told Dr. Thorne that he was welcome to conduct his evaluation. I calmly walked into the small kitchen and filled a kettle with water. I asked my guests if they preferred green or black tea while we discussed my mental state. I set 4 ceramic mugs on a tray, carrying them back into the living room with steady hands. I offered them a seat, inviting the ambush directly into my home, fully prepared for the theatrical performance they were about to stage. Dr. Thorne did not accept the tea. He unlatched his leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of evaluation forms, and clicked his gold pen. He did not begin with standard cognitive baseline questions. He immediately launched into leading, degrading inquiries specifically designed to frustrate and confuse an elderly patient. He asked me if I often forgot where I lived. He asked if I struggled to recognize my own family members, gesturing dramatically toward Brenda and Aaron. He asked if I frequently experienced paranoid delusions regarding my finances. I did not take the bait. I did not show anger or frustration. I answered every single question with terrifying surgical clarity. When he asked about my financial decisions, I did not offer vague justifications. I cited the specific state and federal tax codes that governed the transfer of the commercial properties. I verbally recited the exact legal precedent regarding corporate liability isolation, citing the specific case law Simon and I had reviewed during the restructuring. When he asked about my memory, I recounted the exact date, time, and specific location of Aaron's fraudulent loan origination, listing the name of the private lender and the exact interest rate attached to his high-risk collateral. Dr. Thorne's arrogant smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. He entirely ignored the factual accuracy of my answers. He scribbled furiously on his evaluation forms, deliberately twisting my precise legal citations into examples of obsessive, disorganized thinking. He completed the evaluation in less than 10 minutes. He did not offer a verbal summary. He simply pulled a finalized diagnosis sheet from his briefcase, signed his name with a flourish, and handed the document to Aaron. Dr. Thorne smugly announced that he was officially diagnosing me with severe advanced cognitive decline, recommending immediate full guardianship. Aaron snatched the document from Dr. Thorne's hand, a victorious grin splitting his face. He held the paper up, declaring that they finally possessed the legal leverage to take everything back. I calmly picked up my phone from the plastic dining table. I opened the camera application and snapped a high-definition photograph of the signed medical document resting in Aaron's hand. The flash illuminated the room briefly. I set the phone down and picked up my own mug of tea. I took a slow sip. I looked directly at Dr. Thorne. I informed him that the ceramic mugs they were currently drinking from did not belong to me. I explained that they belonged to Special Agent Miller, a senior investigator with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I pointed to the thin, closed door leading to my small bedroom. I stated that Agent Miller was currently sitting on the other side of that door, actively monitoring the live feed from the security camera and recording every single word of this fraudulent evaluation. I advised Dr. Thorne that submitting a falsified medical diagnosis to secure financial control of a private citizen was a direct violation of federal conspiracy statutes. The victorious grins vanished instantly. Dr. Thorne dropped his gold pen. The heavy silence in the apartment was broken only by the sound of the bedroom door handle slowly beginning to turn. The heavy oak doors of the family court closed with a resounding thud. I sat at the respondent's table with my posture completely straight, my hands resting flat on the polished wood. Simon sat beside me, his briefcase locked and waiting. Across the aisle, Brenda, Aaron, and Megan formed a tight, anxious knot behind their newly hired litigation attorney. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, adjusted her glasses and stared down at the thick manila folder resting on her bench. It contained Dr. Thorne's fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Aaron stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a feigned air of deep sorrow. He approached the podium and began his performance. He spoke passionately to the judge, his voice dripping with manufactured grief. He claimed that over the past 6 months, he had watched my brilliant mind completely deteriorate. He described fabricated instances of me wandering the streets at night, losing track of massive corporate funds, and threatening my own family out of severe paranoia. Aaron declared that I posed an immediate danger to myself and the public. He formally requested that the court declare me mentally incompetent, strip me of all financial autonomy, and grant him full legal guardianship of my remaining estate. He stated it was the only way to protect me from my own rapid cognitive decline. Brenda wiped a fake tear from her cheek, playing the role of the concerned former wife perfectly. Megan nodded along, crossing her arms and glaring at me with supreme arrogance. They had built their entire legal strategy on the assumption that a single corrupt medical document would be enough to permanently silence me. The judge asked if my counsel had a response to the petitioner's severe allegations. Simon stood up. He did not yell. He did not object to Aaron's theatrical performance. He calmly walked to the center of the courtroom and handed a sealed, certified medical dossier directly to the bailiff. Simon informed the judge that we completely rejected the incompetency petition. He stated that Dr. Thorne's evaluation was not just inaccurate, but entirely fabricated to facilitate an aggressive hostile takeover of my private assets. Simon instructed the judge to break the seal on the dossier. Inside was a comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluation conducted just 3 days prior to Dr. Thorne's unannounced ambush. This evaluation was not performed by a local paid-off clinician. It was executed by a panel of 3 independent specialists from the state's top medical board, heavily vetted and sworn under oath. Simon recited their collective findings aloud for the court record. The panel confirmed that I possessed perfect cognitive function, exceptional situational awareness, and total mastery over my complex financial affairs. The medical board explicitly noted that my decision-making capabilities were as sharp and strategic as a man half my age. The judge scrutinized the certified medical seals, comparing them to Dr. Thorne's sloppy, expedited diagnostic sheet. The discrepancy in professional credibility was undeniable. Aaron's feigned sorrow instantly vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrified posture. He looked at Megan, whose arrogant smirk had entirely collapsed. Brenda gripped the edge of the petitioner's table so tightly her knuckles turned white. They realized their primary weapon had just been completely dismantled by an unassailable wall of verified medical science. I watched their panic settle in. They had walked into this courtroom expecting a slaughter, fundamentally misunderstanding who was holding the knife. Simon was not finished. He turned away from the judge and looked directly at Aaron and Megan. He stated that the incompetency petition was not merely a tragic misunderstanding. It was a desperate, calculated shield designed to hide a massive criminal enterprise. Simon reached into his briefcase and produced a small digital storage drive alongside a thick stack of verified banking ledgers. He submitted the drive into evidence, requesting permission to play a specific audio file for the court. The judge granted the request. Simon plugged the drive into the court's media system. Megan's vicious, demanding voice echoed loudly through the high-ceilinged room. Every single person present heard her explicit extortion attempt in my living room. They heard her demand my private retirement funds. They heard her threaten to destroy my reputation with fabricated abuse allegations if I refused to pay Aaron's debts. Megan slumped into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Before the shock could fully register, Simon distributed the banking ledgers to the bench. He outlined the exact, undeniable proof of Aaron's financial crimes. The ledgers meticulously traced the fraudulent loans Aaron secured against Brenda's primary estate. Simon presented the original power of attorney document alongside a certified forensic handwriting analysis. The analysis definitively proved that Aaron had meticulously forged my signature to illegally leverage a multi-million-dollar property. The courtroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The judge stared at the ledgers, her face turning crimson with rising anger. The bailiff instinctively moved closer to the petitioner's table. Aaron sat completely paralyzed. He could not look at the judge, he could not look at his mother, and he absolutely could not look at me. The trap I had patiently constructed over the past 2 years had finally snapped shut, catching all of them simultaneously in its steel jaws. The judge slammed her gavel down with explosive force. Her voice shook with professional fury as she addressed the petitioner's table. She declared the incompetency petition a malicious abuse of the judicial system. She threw the entire filing out immediately, explicitly citing it as a fraudulent attempt to manipulate the court. She did not stop there. She issued immediate crippling financial sanctions against both Aaron and Brenda for filing frivolous and predatory litigation. The fines were massive, demanding payment within 30 days, further compounding their already disastrous financial ruin. The judge then held up the stack of banking ledgers and the forensic handwriting report. She announced that family court was no longer the appropriate venue for this level of extreme deception. She formally ordered the bailiff to forward every piece of evidence, including the audio recording of Megan's extortion attempt and the proof of Aaron's forgery, directly to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal review. She looked Aaron dead in the eye and advised him to retain a criminal defense attorney before the end of the day. The hearing was adjourned. Aaron stood frozen by his chair, his breathing shallow and rapid. The reality of his situation crushed him. He was no longer just a failed businessman facing bankruptcy. He was a documented fraudster facing imminent severe criminal charges and an inescapable federal indictment. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked past their table in total silence. The final business day of the month arrived with ruthless punctuality. I knew exactly what was happening because Gregory, my forensic accountant, was monitoring the tax registry in real time. Brenda had spent the previous 4 weeks living in absolute denial, convinced that her high-priced litigation attorneys could somehow unravel the ironclad corporate restructuring I had built. She operated under the arrogant assumption that federal tax laws did not apply to a woman of her social standing. She ignored the certified letters arriving at the primary estate. She ignored the final notices taped to the glass doors of her newly acquired commercial warehouses. Midnight struck. The federal tax deadline passed. The Internal Revenue Service does not negotiate with willful negligence, and their automated systems possess zero empathy. At precisely 1 minute past midnight, a federal mandate triggered a cascading freeze across her entire financial ecosystem. The $2 million balloon payment attached to the commercial portfolio was now officially delinquent. The government immediately locked the liquid accounts she had aggressively transferred into her personal name following the divorce. The massive revenue she expected to collect from the warehouse tenants was intercepted and seized at the source. She went to sleep in her $3 million mansion, believing she was an untouchable real estate magnate. She woke up entirely severed from the global financial system. The corporate liability I had legally attached to her greed was no longer a looming threat. It was an active, inescapable reality. Brenda was entirely oblivious to the federal freeze when she walked into the city's most exclusive luxury grocery store that afternoon. She pushed her cart down the pristine aisles with the practiced entitlement of a woman who never checked a price tag. She loaded her basket with imported cheeses, organic produce, and expensive bottles of wine, preparing to host a lavish dinner party to celebrate her supposed victory over me. She approached the register, ignoring the cashier's polite greeting. She impatiently tapped her manicured fingers on the marble counter while her items were bagged. The total rang up to nearly $800. Brenda casually handed over her platinum bank card, looking away to check her reflection in the glass display case. The card machine emitted a sharp negative beep. The cashier swiped it a second time. The machine rejected the transaction again, displaying a stark code indicating a hard lock on the account. The cashier politely informed Brenda that the card was declined. Brenda scoffed loudly, blaming the store's outdated equipment. She snatched the card back and slapped a secondary luxury credit card onto the counter, raising her voice to complain about the inconvenience. The cashier processed the secondary card. It was instantly rejected. A line of wealthy patrons began to form behind her. They watched in deafening silence as Brenda furiously dug through her designer purse for a third card. That card was also blocked. The cashier looked at Brenda. It was not a look of respect or deference. It was a look of profound, humiliating pity. The quiet murmurs of the other customers burned her ears. Her face flushed a deep, violent shade of red. She abandoned the cart full of groceries, right at the register, grabbed her phone, and stormed out through the automatic doors. She stood on the concrete sidewalk, dialing her bank's elite customer service line and screaming at the top of her lungs before the representative even said hello. Brenda paced furiously along the edge of the parking lot, demanding the bank representative instantly lift the restriction on her cards. She threatened to close all her accounts and move her non-existent fortune to a competing financial institution. She expected the usual frantic apologies and immediate compliance reserved for top-tier clients. Instead, the bank representative responded with a cold, heavily scripted monotone. He informed Brenda that the bank had no authority to release the funds. He stated that the Internal Revenue Service had served them with a direct order of total asset seizure due to severe tax delinquency. Every single checking, savings, and investment account linked to her Social Security number was frozen pending federal audit. Her credit lines were indefinitely suspended. Brenda stopped pacing. The breath left her lungs as the absolute severity of the situation crushed her chest. She demanded to know how much liquid capital she had access to for an emergency withdrawal. The representative read the screen and informed her she had 0 available funds. Her available balance across all banking institutions was effectively negative. She screamed that there had to be a mistake, citing the commercial real estate portfolio she owned outright. The representative calmly reminded her that the properties were the exact reason for the federal lien. She hung up the phone, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the device on the pavement. She looked back at the glass doors of the grocery store, realizing she could not even afford a bottle of water. Panic overrode her vanity. She needed cash immediately to hire a tax attorney and save her estate from the government. I had cut her off entirely. Her only remaining lifeline was the son she had fiercely protected during the divorce. She ran to her car and drove frantically toward Aaron's upscale neighborhood, convinced he would open his safe and hand her the startup capital she had helped him secure. Brenda sped through the suburban streets, blowing past stop signs in her desperate rush to reach Aaron's house. She turned onto his pristine, tree-lined avenue, expecting to find his quiet, perfectly manicured property. Instead, she slammed on the brakes. Absolute chaos consumed the front yard. 2 massive commercial moving trucks were parked directly on the lawn, their heavy tires leaving deep, muddy trenches in the expensive grass. The front doors of the house were propped wide open. A crew of hired movers was carrying out heavy, custom-built furniture, flat-screen televisions, and expensive art pieces, loading them frantically into the back of the idling trucks. Brenda threw her car into park and scrambled out, demanding to know what was happening. She looked toward the front steps. Megan stood on the concrete porch holding a clipboard and a cup of iced coffee. She was not wearing her usual pristine athletic gear. She wore sharp, aggressive street clothes. Megan pointed sharply at the movers barking ruthless orders to strip the living room bare and load the dining set next. She operated with military efficiency, completely dismantling the home she shared with Aaron. Brenda ran up the driveway, screaming her son's name, demanding answers. Megan looked down at her mother-in-law, a cold, vicious smile spreading across her face as the movers carried the last remnants of Aaron's false success out the door. Brenda marched across the torn-up lawn, the sharp heels of her designer shoes sinking deep into the mud. She grabbed Megan by the elbow, physically spinning her around to demand a complete explanation. Megan did not flinch. She slowly looked down at Brenda's mud-stained shoes and then up to her flushed, panicked face. Megan calmly instructed the movers to load the final set of imported leather chairs and stepped back onto the concrete driveway. She brushed her sleeve where Brenda had touched her face a mask of absolute terrifying apathy. Brenda screamed over the roar of the idling diesel engines, demanding to know where the furniture was going and why Aaron was not outside stopping this madness. Megan pulled a pair of designer sunglasses from her purse and slid them onto her face. She informed Brenda that Aaron was currently at a desperate, futile meeting with his last remaining private investor. She stated with brutal clarity that the furniture was going to a secure storage facility paid for under a completely separate corporate entity. Brenda ordered Megan to halt the moving trucks and open the house safe to provide her with emergency cash to fight the Internal Revenue Service. Megan let out a short, hollow laugh. She looked at Brenda with pure contempt, and declared that she was filing for divorce before the courthouse closed at 5 o'clock. She stated she had spent 5 years tolerating Aaron's pathetic lack of business acumen strictly for the financial lifestyle it afforded her. Now that the lifestyle was entirely compromised by federal tax liens and fraudulent loans, she had zero reason to stay. She explicitly told Brenda she absolutely refused to go down with a sinking ship navigated by a family of arrogant fools. Brenda stood paralyzed, her mind struggling to process this sudden, complete desertion. She threatened Megan, screaming that the divorce courts would strip her of everything she owned. She promised to hire the most vicious litigation attorneys in the state to ensure Megan walked away with absolutely nothing. Megan stepped closer, completely unbothered by the empty threats of a financially ruined woman. She leaned in and delivered the final devastating blow. She calmly revealed that there was absolutely nothing left for the courts to divide. Megan detailed her exit strategy with the surgical precision of a corporate raider. For the past 8 months, as Aaron's medical supply company began to critically hemorrhage capital, Megan had taken over the internal accounting. She exploited Aaron's blind arrogance and his total reliance on her administrative skills. She methodically siphoned the very last drops of his operational capital, completely draining the business accounts. She funneled every single available dollar through a complex web of shell corporations directly into a secure private offshore account, registered entirely under her maiden name. Brenda gasped, realizing the true magnitude of the betrayal. Megan had not just abandoned her husband. She had completely gutted him. Megan smiled, a vicious expression of pure triumph. She explained that the fraudulent loans Aaron took out against the primary estate were never actually used to salvage his failing business. She had intercepted the injected capital the moment it cleared the bank and transferred it entirely out of federal jurisdiction. She orchestrated her exit perfectly, leaving Aaron holding an empty shell of a company heavily anchored to massive illegal debt. She told Brenda that by the time the forensic accountants unraveled the offshore transfers, she would be entirely untouchable. Megan adjusted her sunglasses and turned her back on her mother-in-law, signaling the moving crew to shut the heavy steel doors of the transport trucks. A black luxury sedan abruptly turned into the driveway, its tires screeching against the pavement. Aaron threw the door open before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. He looked disheveled, his tie loosened, and his suit jacket wrinkled from his disastrous investor meeting. He stared at the massive moving trucks blocking his house and the empty living room visible through the open front doors. He sprinted up the driveway, his chest heaving with panic. He grabbed Megan by the shoulders, begging her to explain what was happening. He frantically promised that he could fix the business, claiming he just needed a few more weeks to secure a bridge loan and turn the company around. Megan looked at him with an expression of profound disgust. She physically pushed his hands off her shoulders. She laughed directly in his face, the sound cutting through the thick, tense air of the driveway. She told him his company was completely dead, and his bridge loan was a pathetic fantasy. She explicitly informed him that the business accounts were permanently overdrawn because she had personally emptied them. Aaron staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing as his brain failed to comprehend the reality of his wife's theft. He begged her to stay, his voice cracking with desperate, humiliating panic. He pleaded with her not to leave him when he was facing total financial ruin. Megan opened the door of her sports car. She looked at Aaron with dead, emotionless eyes. She stated loudly, ensuring Brenda heard every single word, that she married a wealthy entrepreneur, and she absolutely refused to remain married to a bankrupt felon. She slid into the driver's seat, started the powerful engine, and reversed out of the driveway without a single backward glance, leaving the wreckage of her marriage entirely behind. Aaron and Brenda stood frozen on the empty concrete driveway. The roar of the moving trucks faded into the distance, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Aaron stared blankly at the tire tracks in his pristine lawn, his breathing shallow and rapid. He had lost his wife, his business capital, and his entire future in the span of 10 minutes. Brenda clutched her worthless luxury handbag, entirely consumed by the realization that her son could offer her absolutely no financial salvation. They were both completely stripped of their wealth, their assets, and their arrogant pride. The sharp, sudden chime of Aaron's cell phone shattered the quiet. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out the device. The screen illuminated, displaying a high-priority email notification. He opened the message, his eyes darting across the bold, formal text. It was a direct official communication from the federal prosecutor's office. The digital document contained no vague threats or preliminary warnings. The formal indictment for massive corporate embezzlement and aggravated wire fraud had been officially filed and processed. Aaron dropped the phone onto the concrete. The screen cracked upon impact. He looked at his mother, his face devoid of all color, entirely consumed by the absolute certainty of his impending incarceration. Brenda looked at Aaron, his face pale and broken, staring at the shattered screen of his phone. She felt no maternal instinct to comfort him. Her own survival was the only priority remaining in her frantic mind. She turned away from her ruined son, got back into her luxury car, and locked the doors. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel as she desperately mentally inventoried every possible remaining asset. Her bank accounts were frozen by the federal government. Her credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. Her commercial properties were seized under federal tax liens. She needed untraceable liquid capital immediately to hire a defense attorney and flee the state before the authorities targeted her next. Then a sharp memory pierced her panic. A year before the divorce proceedings officially began, she had been snooping through my private study at the primary estate. She had found a small, heavy brass key hidden inside a hollowed-out book on my desk. She had secretly pocketed the key, assuming I would eventually forget about it. She knew I was a meticulous man who prepared for worst-case scenarios, a man who built empires by anticipating global market crashes. She had convinced herself over the past year that the key belonged to a private, undisclosed safety deposit box at a downtown private vault. She reasoned that a man of my immense wealth and cautious nature would absolutely keep an emergency reserve of physical gold bars or untraceable bearer bonds hidden from the courts and the IRS. The key was still sitting at the bottom of her jewelry box in her mansion. It was her absolute last hope. She sped away from Aaron's empty driveway, her mind racing with calculations of how quickly she could convert physical gold into cash on the black market. She convinced herself that my secretive paranoia was about to be her ultimate salvation. Brenda rushed into her master bedroom, bypassing the closets she could no longer afford to fill, and dug her frantic fingers into the velvet lining of her jewelry box. Her fingers brushed against the cold brass of the key. She snatched it up, her heart pounding, with a sudden desperate surge of adrenaline. She also retrieved a small emergency stash of $3,000 in cash she had hidden inside a hollowed-out designer shoe heel months ago. It was the absolute last of her liquid capital on Earth. She drove erratically to the private security vault located in the city's financial district. The vault operated independently from standard federal banks, catering to wealthy clients who valued absolute discretion. She marched up to the front desk, slapped the brass key on the polished glass, and demanded immediate access to my box. The vault manager calmly typed her name into the secure terminal, his eyes scanning the glowing red text on his monitor. He looked up with an expression of polite rejection. He informed Brenda that her access authorization to all of my accounts and private boxes had been legally revoked by court order during the finalization of the divorce decree. He stated he could not permit her entry into the secure holding area. Brenda did not argue or cause a scene. She knew screaming would only summon building security and draw unwanted attention. Instead, she waited outside the building until the manager went on his lunch break. She approached a rough-looking independent locksmith she saw operating a mobile key-cutting van parked down the block. She showed him the brass key and explained she was locked out of her own secure box inside the facility due to a clerical error. She pulled the stack of $100 bills from her purse. She offered him the entire $3,000 in cash to bypass the electronic security gate and physically drill the lock on the box. The locksmith looked at the thick stack of untraceable coins. He grabbed his heavy canvas tool bag, accepted the money, and followed her through the side service entrance Brenda had propped open. The basement vault was cold and entirely silent, smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. Brenda led the locksmith down the rows of polished steel boxes until they reached the specific number stamped onto the brass key. The locksmith did not ask any questions regarding the legality of the situation. He pulled a heavy-duty high-torque drill from his canvas bag and pressed the hardened steel bit directly into the center of the dual-locking mechanism. The harsh, grinding scream of metal tearing through metal echoed loudly against the concrete walls. Sparks flew onto the tiled floor as the locksmith forced the drill deeper into the core. Brenda stood right behind him, her entire body vibrating with greedy anticipation. She visualized rows of heavy, gleaming gold bars resting on velvet, enough untraceable wealth to secure a new identity and disappear completely from the wreckage of her life. The locksmith grunted, applying a final surge of pressure until the internal tumblers shattered with a loud, satisfying crack. He pulled the heavy steel door open, packed his drill away, and immediately walked back toward the service exit without saying a single word. Brenda lunged forward. She shoved her hands into the dark rectangular cavity of the steel box. Her fingers did not meet the smooth, cold surface of gold bullion. They did not brush against stacks of neatly banded cash or bearer bonds. The box was almost entirely empty. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She felt a single heavy object resting at the very back of the metal compartment. She pulled it out into the dim fluorescent light of the vault aisle. It was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. There were no markings on the cover. Brenda stared at it, a creeping sensation of pure dread beginning to freeze the blood in her veins. Her hands trembled violently as she slowly lifted the heavy leather cover and turned to the first pristine white page. The silence in the underground vault suddenly felt suffocating, pressing against her lungs as she realized this was not a financial reserve. The first page of the ledger contained a highly detailed chronological index. Brenda turned the page, her eyes widening in absolute horror. The book was a meticulous, decade-long documentation of her deepest, most guarded secrets. There were high-resolution, date-stamped photographs of her entering and leaving various luxury hotels with 4 different men over the past 10 years. Beneath each photograph was a printed itinerary of the exact amounts of marital funds she had spent on those illicit encounters. The documentation was surgically precise, leaving absolutely no room for denial or misinterpretation. But the infidelity was only the beginning. Brenda flipped to the second half of the heavy ledger. She found hundreds of pages of certified banking transfers, routing numbers, and offshore account details. It was undeniable concrete proof that she had been actively and systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from my primary philanthropic charity foundation. The ledger detailed exactly how she had manipulated the charity's vendor invoices to funnel tax-exempt money directly into her personal vanity projects. I had attached a single handwritten note to the very last page of the book. The note simply stated that I had known about every lie, every affair, and every stolen dollar for an entire decade. I had silently gathered the evidence, archived the proof, and waited patiently for the exact perfect moment to let her destroy her own life. Brenda collapsed onto the cold concrete floor of the vault. She realized with terrifying clarity that I had not just anticipated her betrayal. I had orchestrated her absolute destruction from the very beginning. Brenda scrambled out of the underground vault, clutching the heavy black leather ledger against her chest, as if it were a physical weight dragging her directly into the earth. She stumbled through the side service entrance, bursting out into the blinding, suffocating heat of the afternoon sun. The air felt thick and entirely unbreathable. The absolute realization that I had known about her betrayals for a full decade, meticulously documenting every single sordid detail, while she confidently believed she was untouchable, hit her nervous system like a physical blow. She had spent 10 years treating me as a naive, predictable fool, entirely unaware that I was silently architecting her total ruin. She staggered across the private bank parking lot toward her luxury sedan, her designer heels scraping harshly against the baking asphalt. She reached the rear of the car and threw her expensive handbag onto the trunk lid. Her hands were shaking, with such violent, uncontrollable tremors that she could barely manage to pull the zipper open. She dumped the entire contents of the purse onto the hot metal of the car. Expensive cosmetics, useless blocked credit cards, and gold-plated pens clattered and scattered across the reflective surface. She was hunting frantically for the silver butane lighter she kept for her occasional evening cigar. Her panicked mind locked onto a single desperate objective: she had to burn the book immediately. If the physical ledger ceased to exist, she could deny the contents. She could claim it was a fabrication, a jealous ex-husband's pathetic fantasy. She finally grabbed the cold silver metal of the lighter. She ripped a handful of the meticulously detailed pages from the spine of the ledger, tossing them onto the pavement at her feet. She flicked the ignition, summoning a sharp blue flame ready to incinerate the evidence of her 10-year deception. Before the blue flame could even touch the edge of the thick parchment, the violent screech of heavy tires tearing across the asphalt shattered the quiet of the private lot. Two matte black, heavily armored SUVs swerved aggressively off the main street, converging directly on Brenda's position with terrifying calculated speed. They braked hard and at sharp, deliberate angles, effectively boxing her luxury sedan in against the high concrete retaining wall and completely sealing off any potential avenue of escape. Brenda froze in place, the lighter still burning in her trembling hand, her eyes wide with shock. The heavy doors of the vehicles opened in perfect, coordinated unison. 5 federal agents stepped out onto the blistering pavement. They wore dark, tailored suits underneath heavy tactical vests bearing the bold yellow letters of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They moved with a clinical, predatory efficiency that offered zero room for negotiation or argument. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with eyes like chipped ice, pointed directly at Brenda. His voice was a booming, authoritative command that echoed off the surrounding brick buildings. He ordered her to drop the lighter and step completely away from the ledger immediately. Brenda stood paralyzed, her brain completely short-circuiting as the harsh reality of the ambush washed over her. She was no longer a wealthy, untouchable socialite, accustomed to commanding a room with a single glare. She was a cornered suspect, caught actively attempting to destroy criminal evidence. The lead agent closed the distance between them, his hand resting casually but purposefully near his utility belt. He identified himself as Special Agent Vance. He did not yell a second time. He lowered his voice to a cold, dangerous register. He explicitly warned her that attempting to incinerate federal financial evidence was a severe felony, and if she did not extinguish the flame immediately, she would be physically restrained and arrested face down on the baking asphalt, completely stripping her of whatever remaining dignity she thought she possessed. Brenda dropped the silver lighter. It clattered loudly against the pavement, the blue flame extinguishing instantly upon impact. Agent Vance calmly stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy black latex gloves from a tactical pouch on his vest. He knelt down, gathered the torn pages from the ground, and retrieved the thick black ledger from the hood of the car. He did not open the book to inspect its contents. He did not need to verify what was written inside. He looked directly at Brenda, his expression completely devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. He informed her that her desperate attempt to burn the ledger was entirely futile. He explained with surgical and devastating precision that I had legally submitted a certified notarized duplicate of that exact ledger directly to the IRS whistleblower office more than 6 months ago. I had handed the federal government a flawless, deeply cross-referenced roadmap of her entire criminal enterprise long before the divorce papers were ever drafted or signed. Vance detailed the exact reality of her current inescapable situation. He stated she was officially under active federal investigation for severe aggravated tax fraud, multi-jurisdictional wire fraud, and the systematic embezzlement of massive capital reserves from my philanthropic youth foundation. He coldly explained that the government had already conducted a silent, comprehensive audit of the hidden shell companies she had utilized to launder the stolen charity funds. The agency had cross-referenced every single illicit financial transfer with the exact dates, times, and locations she had occupied luxury hotel suites with her illicit partners. Her decade of infidelity was not just a moral failing, it was the documented, heavily tracked mechanism of her federal crimes. Vance informed her that a grand jury was currently convening downtown at that very moment to finalize her multi-count federal indictment, assuring her that the evidence provided was completely airtight and guaranteed a maximum sentence. He watched the last remaining shreds of arrogance drain entirely from her face. Agent Vance turned his attention away from Brenda and looked at the sleek $100,000 luxury sedan she was leaning against. He signaled to another agent holding a digital tablet. Vance formally informed Brenda that the vehicle was subject to immediate civil asset forfeiture. He stated that the forensic audit definitively proved the car was purchased using capital directly siphoned from the Youth Charity Foundation's operational budget. The agent with the tablet stepped forward and flatly demanded her keys. Brenda was completely stripped of her arrogance. She was forced to hand over the electronic fob, standing in total humiliating silence as a federal agent slid into the driver's seat of her prized possession. Vance advised her to expect a formal summons by the end of the week, turned his back on her, and returned to his vehicle. The black SUVs and her stolen luxury car drove out of the parking lot in a tight convoy, leaving Brenda standing completely alone on the scorching asphalt. She had absolutely no money, no functioning credit cards, and no transportation. She was forced to walk the 3 miles back to the primary estate in the suffocating afternoon heat, the blisters on her feet tearing open inside her expensive, impractical shoes. She finally stumbled up the long, winding driveway of her massive property, desperate for the sanctuary of air conditioning and a cold drink. She reached the towering front entrance only to freeze in absolute soul-crushing despair. A thick industrial steel chain was wrapped tightly around the ornate iron gates. A massive fluorescent yellow notice from the bank was pasted directly to the metal, declaring the property officially seized for immediate total foreclosure. Aaron stared at the cracked screen of his phone on the concrete driveway, the reality of the federal embezzlement indictment suffocating his chest. A cornered animal does not surrender peacefully. It lashes out blindly. Aaron abandoned his phone, leaped into his heavily leased sports car, and sped recklessly toward the industrial district. He was completely out of time and out of options, but he knew one place that held the liquid capital required to hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney and secure a private flight out of federal jurisdiction. He drove directly to the main logistics warehouse, the beating heart of the empire I had built from scratch over 4 decades. He intended to stage an aggressive, hostile takeover, seize emergency executive control, and drain the primary operational accounts before the government could freeze them. Aaron slammed his car into the reserved executive parking spot and sprinted through the administrative glass doors. He bypassed the front desk entirely, ignoring the receptionist's shocked protests, and marched straight onto the active, deafening warehouse floor. The roar of forklifts, hydraulic lifts, and conveyor belts filled the massive space. Aaron climbed atop a stack of heavy wooden shipping pallets to elevate himself above the workers. He clapped his hands violently, screaming at the top of his lungs to demand their immediate attention. He loudly proclaimed that due to my sudden and severe medical incapacitation, he was assuming total operational control of the entire logistics network. He ordered the shift managers to bring the chief financial officer to him instantly, demanding the access codes to the overnight transit vaults and the main operational safes. He shrieked that any employee who failed to comply with his direct commands would be terminated on the spot, stripped of their severance, and blacklisted from the industry forever. The deafening mechanical noise of the warehouse slowly ground to an absolute halt. Hundreds of workers wearing heavy steel-toed boots and high-visibility vests ceased their labor. They turned to stare at the frantic, disheveled man screaming empty threats from atop a stack of wooden pallets. They did not bow to his assumed authority. They did not rush to fulfill his desperate, frantic demands. Instead, the massive crowd of laborers parted seamlessly down the center aisle, making way for a single, deeply imposing figure. Thomas, the head warehouse foreman, walked slowly and deliberately toward Aaron. Thomas was a man carved from absolute loyalty, grit, and decades of brutal physical labor. He and I had unloaded the very first delivery trucks together 40 years ago, when the company was nothing more than a single rented dock. He knew the true soul of this enterprise better than anyone alive. Thomas was completely unimpressed by Aaron's expensive designer suit, or his loud, aggressive posturing. He stepped directly in front of the pallets, crossing his thick, calloused arms over his chest. He stood as an immovable physical barricade between Aaron and the administrative offices holding the company safes. Aaron pointed a violently shaking finger at Thomas, commanding him to step aside and fetch the master keys to the operational vault immediately. Aaron screamed that as my sole legitimate heir, his authority over the business was absolute and unquestionable. He threatened to have Thomas arrested for corporate insubordination and physically thrown off the property by private security if he delayed the transfer of funds by even a single minute. Thomas did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He looked up at Aaron with a potent mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He spoke in a low, gravelly register that carried perfectly across the dead silent warehouse floor. Thomas calmly informed Aaron that he possessed zero authority to terminate anyone, zero right to issue corporate commands, and absolutely zero access to a single dollar stored within the facility. Aaron's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered rage. He jumped down from the wooden pallets, invading Thomas's personal space with aggressive entitlement. He screamed that blood dictated legal ownership, declaring that the logistics business belonged entirely to his family, and therefore it belonged exclusively to him. He demanded the workers recognize his divine birthright and open the heavy steel safes before he ruined every single one of their livelihoods. Thomas maintained his ground, completely unbothered by the escalating tantrum. He slowly reached into the deep breast pocket of his heavy canvas work jacket and pulled out a neatly folded, heavily laminated corporate legal bulletin. He handed the thick document directly to Aaron, firmly advising him to read the active corporate structure before making any more embarrassing and legally inaccurate public declarations. Aaron snatched the paper aggressively from Thomas's hand, his panicked eyes frantically scanning the bold, notarized legal print. It was an official, irrevocable certification of corporate transition ratified by the State Labor Board and federal tax authorities. I had not simply hidden my massive wealth from Brenda and Aaron behind standard trust funds or shell companies. I had fundamentally restructured the very foundation of my life's work to protect it from parasites. The legal document proved that exactly 1 year prior to the divorce filings, I had legally transitioned the entire multi-million-dollar logistics company into a fully functioning, legally binding, employee-owned cooperative. I had voluntarily surrendered all of my majority shares, transferring total equity ownership and operational autonomy directly to the men and women who had actually bled to build the empire. The hundreds of workers standing around Aaron were no longer my employees. They were the legal, fully vested owners of the corporation. I had permanently secured their financial futures, while simultaneously ensuring my greedy son could never touch a single dime of the company's profit. The operational safes Aaron desperately wanted to drain belonged collectively to the 400 people staring him down. Aaron stared at the laminated corporate bulletin, his hands trembling violently as the last remaining shred of his fabricated reality crumbled into absolute dust. He owned completely nothing. He had zero leverage, zero administrative authority, and zero stolen capital to escape his impending federal criminal indictment. He looked up from the document, his terrified eyes scanning the hundreds of furious workers surrounding him. They were no longer simply observing his pathetic meltdown in silence. They were actively advancing on his position, their faces hardened with disgust. Thomas looked at Aaron, took a slow step back, and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the crew. 6 burly, massive dock workers stepped forward, moving with practiced, undeniable synchronization. They did not ask Aaron politely to leave the premises. They grabbed him violently by the arms and the collar of his ruined suit jacket, physically lifting his expensive leather shoes completely off the concrete floor. Aaron kicked and thrashed wildly, screaming hollow, desperate threats as they carried him effortlessly down the main transit corridor, like a piece of discarded garbage. They marched him directly toward the open rear loading bays, where the heavy, relentless rain from the night before had turned the commercial truck yard into a slick, filthy, stagnant swamp. Without a single word of hesitation or remorse, the workers launched him forcefully out the elevated bay doors. Aaron tumbled through the damp air and landed hard face first in the deep freezing mud of the shipping yard. He lay there, his pristine suit utterly destroyed, gasping for breath, as the heavy steel loading doors slammed firmly and permanently shut above him, locking him out of the empire he had tried to steal. Megan moved through the glittering ballroom of the city's most exclusive philanthropic gala with the calculated grace of an apex predator. She had abandoned Aaron in his muddy driveway less than 48 hours ago, completely unbothered by his impending criminal indictment or his total financial ruin. To Megan, a sinking ship was merely a temporary inconvenience and an opportunity to commandeer a much better lifeboat. She was entirely confident that the offshore account containing the stolen remnants of Aaron's business capital made her untouchable. She believed she had executed the perfect, flawless escape. She arrived at the gala wearing a stunning, custom-tailored silk gown, purchased specifically for this evening, intending to project an image of pristine, unaffected wealth. Her objective was straightforward and ruthlessly pragmatic. She needed to secure her next husband, preferably an older, severely wealthy executive, before the local society pages realized she was in the process of finalizing a messy divorce. She mingled among the city's elite, laughing at the right moments, lightly touching the arms of powerful men, and positioning herself as a highly desirable independent socialite. She drank expensive champagne and completely ignored the quiet whispers regarding the rapid, scandalous collapse of Aaron's medical supply company. She had successfully insulated herself from the collateral damage. She operated under the absolute delusion that she had outsmarted everyone, including me. She felt utterly superior to the fools she had left behind to face the federal prosecutors. The opulent setting of the charity gala was her natural habitat, a place where money equated to invincibility, and she fully intended to leverage her stolen capital to cement her permanent place at the very top of the social hierarchy. She scanned the elegant room, entirely unaware that the foundation she was standing on had already been systematically demolished. The centerpiece of the evening was a highly publicized silent auction designed to fund pediatric medical research. The gala transitioned into the main ballroom, where the auctioneer took the stage to present the premier luxury items. Megan knew that to attract the caliber of wealthy suitors, she required that she needed to make a highly visible, dominant financial statement. She needed to broadcast her independence and her immense purchasing power to every billionaire in the room. The auctioneer introduced an exclusive, all-inclusive luxury safari package in Botswana, an item highly coveted by the elite crowd. The bidding started at $20,000. Megan immediately raised her paddle, projecting an aura of total boredom, as if spending tens of thousands of dollars was a trivial inconvenience. A prominent tech CEO counterbid at $30,000. Megan did not hesitate. She instantly raised the bid to $40,000, locking eyes with the CEO and offering him a sharp, challenging smile. The room buzzed with excitement as the aggressive bidding war escalated. When the CEO pushed the price to $45,000, Megan stood up slightly, ensuring the entire ballroom was watching her. She raised her paddle high and stated her final bid of $50,000 with absolute, unwavering confidence. The CEO conceded, offering her a polite nod of defeat. The auctioneer slammed his gavel, officially awarding the luxury package to Megan. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause, admiring her incredible generosity and her commanding presence. She soaked in the validation, reveling in the spotlight and the appreciative glances of the wealthy men surrounding her table. She had successfully purchased the exact social dominance she craved. She stood up and sauntered toward the event organizer's payment desk, located near the edge of the stage, moving with the supreme arrogance of a woman who held the world securely in her manicured hands. She pulled a sleek, heavy metal bank card from her clutch, tied directly to the offshore account she had funded with Aaron's stolen capital, and confidently handed it to the financial director to process her extravagant charitable donation. The event organizer swiped the heavy metal card through the secure payment terminal with a polite, appreciative smile. Megan stood at the counter casually checking her reflection in her phone screen, completely expecting the transaction to clear instantly. The machine emitted a sharp, discordant beep. The organizer's smile faltered slightly as he looked at the small digital screen. He apologized for the technical delay, wiped the magnetic strip on his jacket, and processed the card a second time. The machine rejected the transaction again, this time flashing a stark red code that indicated a total international freeze. The organizer discreetly leaned forward, lowering his voice, and informed Megan that her financial institution was actively blocking the transfer. Megan scoffed loudly, treating the man like an incompetent servant. She demanded he run it a third time aggressively, insisting that the offshore account held hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid capital. She had absolutely no idea that Gregory, my brilliant forensic accountant, had completely dismantled her exit strategy before she even reached the gala. The moment Megan illegally siphoned Aaron's corporate funds, Gregory tracked the digital routing numbers through the complex web of shell companies. Because those funds were intrinsically tied to Aaron's active federal embezzlement investigation, Gregory simply packaged the digital tracking data and forwarded it directly to the federal authorities. The International Financial Police, acting in direct coordination with Interpol, immediately flagged the offshore account as a repository for stolen corporate assets. They had executed a hard, impenetrable freeze on her offshore banking profile that very morning. The money was not just blocked. It was officially seized as evidence in a massive federal fraud case. The event organizer ran the card for the third and final time. The terminal locked the card entirely, displaying a message instructing the merchant to confiscate the plastic and contact the authorities. Megan stared at the glowing red screen, her stomach plummeting into a bottomless abyss. The impenetrable fortress she had built around her stolen wealth had completely evaporated, leaving her absolutely penniless. The event organizer lost the last remnants of his polite composure. He loudly informed Megan that her card was not only declined, but officially flagged for immediate confiscation due to suspected fraud. His voice carried across the quiet perimeter of the stage, drawing the immediate attention of the surrounding high society guests. The whispers began instantly. The wealthy suitors who had admired her aggressive bidding mere moments ago now stared at her with open, mocking disgust. Megan panicked desperately, demanding her card back and screaming that there had to be a banking error. The organizers signaled the private security team. Two massive guards in dark suits stepped forward, flanking Megan aggressively. They loudly instructed her to leave the premises immediately, refusing to allow her to return to her table or speak to the other guests. She was publicly paraded across the entire length of the glittering ballroom, her face burning with unparalleled, inescapable humiliation. The elite crowd parted to let the security team escort the exposed fraudster toward the exit. As the guards forcefully marched her past the primary VIP section, Megan jerked her head to the side. I was sitting quietly at the center table wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, surrounded by the most influential board members in the city. I did not smile, and I did not gloat. I simply picked up my crystal glass of ice water and raised it toward her in a slow, silent, and absolute toast as she was shoved out the heavy mahogany doors into the unforgiving night. Brenda stood shivering before the chained iron gates of the primary estate, her mind entirely blank with the shock of her sudden catastrophic downfall. She clutched the heavy damning ledger to her chest, the very book that guaranteed her federal incarceration. Moments later, a bruised and utterly defeated figure dragged himself up the private, winding residential road. It was Aaron, his expensive, custom-tailored suit completely destroyed and caked in thick, foul-smelling mud, from the industrial warehouse loading dock. He looked at his mother's torn designer clothes, then slowly lifted his gaze to the massive fluorescent yellow foreclosure notice glued directly to the metal bars of their home. They did not exchange a single word of comfort or explanation. Driven by pure, primal desperation and the immediate need to hide from the world, they decided to scale the ornate wrought iron fence. Brenda tore the delicate silk fabric of her dress and severely scraped her knees against the sharp metal spikes, while Aaron's muddy, shaking hands slipped repeatedly until they both finally dropped heavily onto the damp, manicured grass of their own front lawn. They slinked around the perimeter of the massive structure like common desperate thieves and forced open an unlocked service door near the catering kitchen. Once inside, they were instantly engulfed in absolute suffocating darkness. Brenda instinctively reached for the crystal lamp switch resting on the marble hallway console, but the room remained pitch black. The municipal utility companies alerted to the severe federal indictments, and the massive intentionally ignored unpaid balances had completely severed the electrical grid to the entire property. They wandered aimlessly into the cavernous main living room, surrounded by millions of dollars of imported artwork, grand pianos, and custom Italian furniture they could no longer even see. They collapsed together onto the cold leather sofas. The silence in the massive mansion was heavy and intensely oppressive, completely unbroken by the familiar hum of central heating or the ambient glow of security monitors. They sat together in the freezing dark, totally isolated in a hollow, lifeless tomb of their own arrogant making, completely unable to process the absolute totality of their sudden, irreversible destitution. The heavy, suffocating silence of the dark mansion was suddenly and violently shattered. Intense, rhythmic flashes of brilliant red and blue light sliced directly through the massive, uncurtained bay windows. The sweeping, aggressive strobes bounced wildly off the hanging crystal chandeliers and illuminated the shadowy living room with a harsh, unforgiving glare. Aaron jumped to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs in sheer, unadulterated panic. Brenda pressed herself deeply into the corner of the leather sofa, her eyes wide with overwhelming terror. The heavy, authoritative sound of tactical boots echoed loudly across the exterior stone tiles of the front porch. A booming, aggressive knock rattled the custom mahogany double doors, physically shaking the reinforced doorframe. A deep, commanding voice demanded immediate entry, explicitly identifying themselves as the county sheriff's department. Brenda heard the sharp, distinct jingle of heavy keys. The federal banking institution had clearly already provided the local authorities with total master access to the seized estate. The heavy front doors swung open with a loud, echoing groan. Brilliant, blinding beams from high-powered tactical flashlights cut sharply through the darkness, pinning Brenda and Aaron against the back wall like trapped, helpless animals. 4 heavily armed sheriff's deputies stepped into the grand foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. Behind the officers stood 2 stern, uncompromising representatives from the federal banking institution, clutching thick leather clipboards. The lead deputy aimed his intense flashlight directly into Aaron's mud-stained, bruised face, loudly demanding to know why they were illegally trespassing on federally seized property. Brenda desperately tried to summon her old commanding arrogance. She stood up on shaking legs, claiming this was her legal residence and demanding the officers leave the premises immediately. The senior bank representative stepped forward with absolute icy calm, completely ignoring her pathetic attempt at authority. He handed her a brightly colored, laminated legal document. It was the absolute, irrevocable final notice of immediate foreclosure and eviction. He explained with zero empathy that the property had legally reverted to the bank 48 hours ago due to fraudulent loan defaults, massive tax liens, and the active federal indictment. He stated brutally that they had zero legal right to be inside the structure, and the house now belonged entirely to the federal government. The lead deputy stepped forward. His expression hardened and delivered the ultimate, uncompromising ultimatum. He informed Brenda and Aaron that they had exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever basic personal clothing they could physically carry and vacate the premises immediately. He explicitly warned them that if they remained inside the structure past the 10-minute mark, they would be placed in handcuffs, arrested for felony trespassing, and transported directly to the county lockup to await their respective federal fraud hearings. Aaron completely broke down. The last remaining ounce of fight completely drained from his exhausted body. He scrambled frantically up the grand curved staircase in the dark, desperately grabbing random wrinkled shirts and trousers from his ruined master closet and shoving them into whatever cheap containers he could find. Brenda, however, completely snapped. Her fragile mental state simply could not process the total, instantaneous loss of her wealthy identity and the absolute end of her luxurious lifestyle. She absolutely refused to move. She rushed to the base of the grand staircase and gripped the ornate marble banister with both hands, her knuckles turning bone white with unhinged desperation. She screamed hysterically, her voice echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer. She demanded immediate access to her elite litigation lawyers, her private wealth managers, and her high society friends. She shrieked that she was a woman of immense social status and could not be thrown out onto the street like a common vagrant. The deputies remained completely unmoved by her theatrical, desperate meltdown. They stood in total silence, watching the digital clock on their tactical radios count down the seconds. The 10 minutes evaporated instantly. Aaron stumbled back down the stairs, weeping softly, clutching 2 flimsy black plastic trash bags filled with discarded clothing. The lead deputy pointed a firm, uncompromising finger toward the open front door. Brenda adamantly refused to let go of the marble banister, sobbing violently and demanding they show her the respect she deserved. 2 female deputies stepped forward without a single moment of hesitation. They systematically and forcefully pried Brenda's manicured fingers off the cold stone one by one. They gripped her tightly by the upper arms, lifting her forcefully to her feet with professional, undeniable strength. She thrashed and wailed, kicking her ruined designer shoes against the hardwood floor. But her physical resistance was entirely futile against the highly trained officers. The deputies physically marched Brenda and Aaron out the massive front doors, guiding them roughly down the sweeping marble steps and across the immaculate circular driveway. They escorted them entirely off the property premises, pushing them past the massive iron gates and directly onto the public concrete curb. A sudden freezing downpour began to fall from the pitch-black sky, washing the remaining dried mud from Aaron's bruised face and completely soaking Brenda's torn designer dress to the bone. The bank representatives pulled the heavy iron gates shut with a loud metallic clang and snapped a massive titanium padlock into place, physically sealing the luxurious estate forever. Brenda and Aaron stood shivering violently under the harsh flickering streetlights, clutching 2 pathetic black trash bags containing the absolute entirety of their remaining worldly possessions. Brenda slowly looked up and down the exclusive, highly guarded street. The massive, brightly lit mansions of her former high society friends and wealthy peers loomed in the surrounding darkness, their windows glowing warmly against the freezing rain. She saw perfectly still silhouettes standing behind the expensive sheer curtains of the neighboring estates. The neighborhood elite were watching the entire spectacular downfall unfold. They stood in the safety and warmth of their secure homes, witnessing the complete, absolute destruction of the arrogant woman who had once ruthlessly dominated their social circles and judged their every move. Not a single custom front door opened. Not a single security gate unlocked to offer sanctuary. Not a single person stepped out into the rain to offer an umbrella, a ride, a phone call, or a shred of human sympathy. The heavy rain beat down relentlessly on the cold pavement, as Brenda realized with terrifying, undeniable clarity that she had been completely and permanently erased from the world she once ruled. Brenda and Aaron trudged through the relentless freezing rain, their expensive, ruined clothing clinging to their shivering bodies. They carried the black trash bags containing the meager remains of their livas over their shoulders, moving like broken refugees fleeing a war zone they had started. They walked for miles through the darkness, navigating the treacherous, flooded sidewalks of the city's outer districts. They had completely exhausted their entire network of high society contacts. Every single phone call they had attempted from a damp public payphone had gone straight to voicemail or resulted in a sharp, definitive dial tone the moment they identified themselves. They had nowhere left to run, no hidden offshore accounts to access, and absolutely zero remaining allies in the world. Their desperate, frantic journey led them inevitably to the modest brick apartment building where I had quietly relocated following the divorce. They climbed the concrete steps of the narrow, unlit stairwell, their wet shoes squeaking against the linoleum. They reached my door and began to pound against the solid oak wood with the flat of their freezing hands. Brenda wailed loudly, her voice echoing down the empty, narrow corridor, screaming my name and begging for immediate sanctuary from the freezing rain. Aaron kicked the base of the door, completely abandoning his arrogant composure, crying out that he was my flesh and blood and demanded to be let inside before the police tracked them down. They stood huddled together on the worn welcome mat, a pathetic, dripping manifestation of total failure, desperately hoping to exploit the very last remaining drop of my compassion. The heavy deadbolt clicked sharply, and the solid oak door slowly swung open, revealing the warm, softly lit interior of my modest apartment. I stood in the doorway, dressed in a simple, clean flannel shirt and comfortable jeans, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. I looked entirely unbothered by the late hour or the frantic, desperate pounding that had disrupted my evening. I did not step aside to invite them in. I did not offer them towels or dry clothing. I simply stood there, an immovable physical barrier between them and the safety they so desperately craved. Brenda immediately dropped her black trash bags onto the wet hallway floor. She threw herself entirely to her knees, clutching the fabric of my jeans with her freezing, mud-stained hands. She looked up at me, her face completely ruined by running mascara and terror, and launched into a hysterical, practiced monologue. She sobbed violently, claiming that her entire decade of infidelity and massive corporate embezzlement was a terrible, tragic mistake born of extreme emotional confusion. She desperately attempted to rewrite history, insisting that she had been brutally manipulated by her financial advisors and completely misled by the men she had slept with. She begged me to take her back, promising to spend the rest of her life serving me and making amends for her temporary lapses in judgment. She swore on her life that she still loved me deeply, and that our 40 years of marriage could be instantly repaired if I would simply open my door and protect her from the federal prosecutors currently hunting her. Aaron pushed his kneeling mother slightly aside, desperation entirely overriding his usual profound arrogance. His teeth chattered audibly as he gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white with panic. He looked at me with wild, terrified eyes and launched into his own frantic, pathetic plea. He did not apologize for attempting to violently seize my company. He did not express a single ounce of remorse for his massive, fraudulent financial crimes or his deep, aggressive entitlement. Instead, he immediately played the ultimate victim. He shrieked that the federal government was entirely misinterpreting his business strategies and aggressively targeting him unfairly. He sobbed openly, begging me to liquidate my remaining retirement assets immediately to hire a team of top-tier aggressive criminal defense attorneys. He claimed he desperately needed my financial salvation to keep him out of federal prison, insisting that as my only son, it was my absolute moral obligation to clean up his legal disaster. He swore that if I saved him from incarceration, he would finally respect my legacy and become the loyal, dedicated heir I had always wanted. I stood perfectly still, letting his frantic, self-serving monologue wash entirely over me. I looked down at the two shivering, desperate figures groveling on my welcome mat. I felt absolutely zero anger, zero resentment, and zero lingering affection. The deep, agonizing pain of their betrayals had burned out months ago, leaving nothing behind but cold, calculated clarity. I looked at Brenda's ruined face and Aaron's terrified eyes with complete, absolute, terrifying emotionlessness. They were no longer my family. They were simply two strangers suffering the direct, unavoidable consequences of their own spectacular greed. I looked directly into Brenda's weeping eyes, and then shifted my gaze to Aaron's trembling, panicked face. I did not raise my voice, nor did I express any trace of vindictiveness or cruelty. I spoke with a quiet, absolute certainty that cut through their hysterical sobbing like a surgical blade. I explained to them that true forgiveness is a gift freely given, a release of the anger that poisons the soul. I told them that I had already completely forgiven them for the infidelity, the theft, and the relentless, suffocating disrespect. However, I calmly clarified that while forgiveness is free, absolute trust is a currency that must be meticulously earned over a lifetime. I stated with brutal, unwavering precision that they had spent the last 40 years continuously proving through every single action and decision that they were fundamentally incapable of being trusted with my love, my loyalty, or my resources. I informed them that my obligation to protect them from the consequences of their own actions had permanently expired the moment they chose to destroy our family for their own selfish gain. I did not wait for their inevitable frantic rebuttals. I simply stepped back into the warmth of my quiet sanctuary and firmly, decisively pulled the heavy oak door shut until the deadbolt locked securely into place, permanently severing their access to my life. The heavy oak door of my apartment clicked shut, the deadbolt engaging with a sharp, metallic finality that echoed down the narrow corridor. Brenda and Aaron stood paralyzed on the worn welcome mat for a long moment, the reality of my absolute rejection washing over them. With no remaining options and their physical energy completely depleted, they slowly descended the concrete stairwell. They pushed through the lobby doors and collapsed onto the wet, freezing concrete of the public sidewalk just outside the building's main entrance. The relentless rain soaked right through their ruined designer clothing, plastering their hair to their faces and chilling them to the bone. They sat beside their two pathetic black trash bags, shivering violently under the flickering amber glow of a nearby street lamp. The silence between them lasted only a few minutes before the venomous resentment boiled over. Aaron turned toward his mother, his face contorted into a vicious sneer. He screamed that this entire catastrophe was entirely her fault, blaming her reckless spending and her arrogant, sloppy embezzlement for drawing the attention of the federal authorities. He shrieked that if she had just been satisfied with the marital assets, he would have never needed to forge those disastrous loans to save the family image. Brenda fired back instantly, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek that pierced the quiet neighborhood. She viciously attacked his pathetic lack of business acumen, screaming that his sheer incompetence had driven the logistics company to the brink of bankruptcy long before she ever touched the charity funds. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at his chest, declaring that he had allowed a trophy wife to bleed his accounts dry while he played the role of a powerful executive. They traded vicious, unforgiving insults on the wet pavement, tearing each other apart with the same ruthless cruelty they had once reserved exclusively for me. Their bitter, screaming argument echoed down the dark, rain-slicked street, completely blinding them to the world outside their own toxic orbit. They were so entirely consumed by shifting the blame that they did not notice the three dark vehicles turning the corner in perfect predatory synchronization. 3 county police cruisers glided down the residential avenue, operating entirely without sirens, their headlights cut to maintain the element of absolute surprise. The heavy sedans pulled up abruptly to the curb, directly in front of the apartment building, boxing in the small stretch of sidewalk where Brenda and Aaron sat shivering. The sudden, intense glare of tactical spotlights hit them like physical blows, instantly blinding them and cutting their vicious argument short. The heavy doors of the cruisers opened in unison, and 6 officers stepped out onto the wet pavement. They moved with a rigid, highly coordinated efficiency that signaled extreme legal severity. There was no casual approach, no polite inquiry, and no room for negotiation. The lead detective, a tall man wearing a heavy rain jacket over his tactical vest, marched directly toward the concrete steps. He held 2 thick, sealed manila folders in his right hand. He stopped just inches from Brenda and Aaron, his boots splashing heavily in a deep puddle. He did not ask for their identities. He simply stated their full legal names with a cold, absolute certainty that froze the blood in their veins. He announced that he was executing two highly expedited multi-agency federal arrest warrants issued directly by the grand jury convening downtown. Aaron scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his mouth opening and closing in pure, unadulterated terror as he stared at the gold badge pinned to the detective's chest. Brenda remained completely frozen on the wet concrete, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The ultimate, inescapable consequences of their decades of unchecked greed had finally arrived to collect the debt. The officers fanned out rapidly, surrounding them, in a tight, impenetrable tactical circle, completely sealing off any desperate final attempt to flee into the darkness. The lead detective gestured sharply, and two broad-shouldered officers lunged forward, grabbing Aaron aggressively by his soaked, ruined suit jacket. They hauled him violently to his feet, ignoring his pathetic, whimpering pleas for a phone call. They slammed him face first against the slick, wet hood of the nearest cruiser, spreading his legs and forcing his arms behind his back. The detective stepped close to Aaron's ear, projecting his voice over the pouring rain. He formally read Aaron his Miranda rights, simultaneously detailing the massive, unsealable charges leveled against him. He informed Aaron that he was being officially indicted for aggravated corporate bank fraud, grand larceny, and the systematic forgery of federal loan documents. The detective explicitly mentioned the catastrophic illegal loans leveraged against the primary estate, verifying that the forensic accountants had successfully traced every single fraudulent signature. Simultaneously, two female officers approached Brenda. She attempted to violently swat their hands away, screaming hysterically that she was a woman of high society and demanding to speak to the chief of police. The officers were entirely unmoved by her theatrical delusion. They seized her arms with brutal professional force, dragging her off the cold concrete and shoving her heavily against the side panel of the second cruiser. The cold metal pressed uncomfortably against her tear-stained face. The detective turned his attention to her, his voice devoid of any shred of human sympathy. He loudly declared her charges, officially arresting her for the severe, prolonged embezzlement of philanthropic charity funds, multi-jurisdictional money laundering, and massive deliberate federal tax evasion. He specifically cited the offshore accounts she had desperately tried to protect, completely shattering her absolute delusion of safety. The harsh, heavy ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking tightly around their wrists echoed through the quiet street. The cold metal bit deeply into their skin, a permanent, undeniable physical reminder of their sudden, total loss of freedom. They were no longer wealthy elites commanding respect. They were fully processed federal criminals being actively prepared for transport to the county lockup. The officers forcefully guided Brenda and Aaron away from the hoods of the vehicles, shoving their heads down to maneuver them into the caged back seats of the waiting cruisers. The heavy reinforced doors slammed shut with a definitive claustrophobic thud, locking them securely inside the dark, confined spaces. The thick plexiglass partitions separated them entirely from the front seats, leaving them in absolute, terrifying isolation. The flashing red and blue strobe lights cast harsh, rhythmic shadows across their pale, ruined faces. As the lead detective signaled for the convoy to depart, Brenda pressed her tear-streaked cheek against the cold, rain-splattered window of the police cruiser. She tilted her head upward, her desperate, terrified eyes frantically scanning the brick facade of my apartment building. Her gaze locked onto the single illuminated window on the third floor. I was standing perfectly still behind the clean glass, my arms crossed casually over my chest. I looked down at the flashing lights and the definitive end of her criminal reign with absolute, terrifying calmness. I did not offer a smile of triumph, nor did I display a single ounce of lingering pity. I simply watched the inevitable, calculated conclusion of the trap I had patiently set 10 years ago. As the cruiser engines roared to life and the vehicles began to pull away from the curb, I reached out and firmly flicked the switch on the wall. The light in my apartment extinguished instantly, plunging the window into absolute darkness, permanently closing the final chapter of their existence. 6 months passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the wet pavement outside my old apartment. The heavy, suffocating weight of deception that had crushed my chest for a decade was completely gone. I stood on the wide, cedar-planked balcony of my new home, breathing in the crisp morning air. The house was not a sprawling, ostentatious estate, like the one Brenda had so fiercely guarded. It was a moderately sized, elegantly structured craftsman home nestled quietly in the forested hills just outside the city limits. There were no marble foyers, no imported crystal chandeliers, and absolutely no hollow echoes of simulated affection. The space was filled only with the rich scent of pine, the warmth of natural sunlight, and the profound, absolute serenity of a life completely reclaimed. I looked down at my hands resting on the wooden railing. They no longer trembled with the suppressed anxiety of maintaining a fractured family facade. My physical health had drastically improved without the constant toxic stress of navigating Aaron's volatile greed and Brenda's endless financial demands. My doctor recently noted my blood pressure was perfect, attributing the remarkable change to a simplified diet and the sudden removal of chronic environmental toxins. The toxic elements in my life had been exclusively human. I watched the wind rustle through the dense canopy of evergreen trees, feeling a deep, resonating vibrancy returning to my bones. The profound isolation I had felt while surrounded by my own flesh and blood had been replaced by a genuine, undeniable peace. I had excised the rotting foundation of my past with surgical precision, leaving only clean, fertile ground to build whatever remained of my future. The silent adjustment I had orchestrated was complete, but the final administrative closure of the old world was arriving this very morning. The sharp crunch of tires on the gravel driveway announced the arrival of Simon, my lead legal counsel, and the steadfast architect of my protective trusts. He stepped out of his modest sedan carrying a thick, heavily bound leather briefcase. Simon possessed a mind like a steel trap, a man who shared my absolute disdain for unearned arrogance. I walked through the glass patio doors to meet him in the bright, open-concept living room. He did not offer empty pleasantries. He immediately placed a stack of finalized court-certified documents onto the solid oak dining table. He looked up, his expression a mask of professional satisfaction, and delivered the ultimate casualty report of my former family's collapsing empire. Aaron's federal trial had concluded with remarkable speed. Stripped of my financial backing, and facing a mountain of undeniable hard-coded forensic evidence regarding his bank fraud and forgery, his expensive defense attorneys had rapidly abandoned him. He was currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary, completely cut off from the luxurious lifestyle he believed was his birthright. Brenda's fate was distinctly different, yet equally absolute. Facing decades of federal incarceration for massive charity embezzlement and aggravated tax evasion, she had broken completely during the initial interrogations. She accepted a brutal ironclad plea agreement orchestrated by the federal prosecutors. She avoided prison by legally binding herself to severe financial restitution. For the next 20 years, the woman who once refused to wear the same designer dress twice was legally mandated to work a strict minimum wage job. Every single dollar she earned above the federal poverty line was to be aggressively garnished and funneled directly back into the philanthropic charity she had so callously plundered. Simon then detailed the international manhunt for Megan. Interpol had successfully extradited her from her attempted offshore sanctuary. She was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, without bail, facing a massive labyrinth of international wire fraud charges that guaranteed she would not see the outside of a concrete cell for a very long time. I sat down at the table and carefully reviewed the heavy stack of legal judgments, reading the precise clinical language that officially dissolved the absolute worst mistakes of my life. There was no joy in reading the sentencing reports, nor was there any lingering sorrow. It was simply the necessary, undeniable accounting of debts finally paid in full. I pushed the conviction files aside and pulled the final, most crucial document toward me. This was the ultimate objective of my entire silent campaign. It was not enough to merely neutralize the greed that had infected my family. I needed to permanently secure the capital they had so desperately attempted to steal. I picked up my pen, feeling the smooth, solid weight of the metal between my fingers. The The document before me was an irrevocable, ironclad deed of transfer. I signed my name with a steady, deliberate hand, legally moving the absolute entirety of my remaining personal wealth, liquid assets, and private investments into a newly established, highly protected trust. The capital was permanently dedicated to funding a comprehensive full-ride scholarship program for underprivileged youth in the gritty working-class hometown where I had originally built my logistics business. I was ensuring that the millions of dollars Brenda and Aaron had viewed as their unearned royal inheritance would instead provide education, housing, and genuine opportunity to children who actually understood the profound value of hard work. I legally mandated that the scholarship fund be overseen by an independent rotating board of former logistics employees, guaranteeing that my bloodline could never challenge the trust or access a single cent. My wealth was now entirely detached from my toxic lineage. I placed the pen down on the oak table. The signature was dry and the transfer was instantly binding. My legacy was no longer a towering pile of hoarded cash waiting to be fought over by arrogant vultures. My legacy was a permanent engine of opportunity, completely untouchable and entirely pure. I handed the signed, irrevocable trust documents back to Simon. He carefully secured them inside his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. The legal battlefield was officially cleared. I stood up and walked toward the open kitchen, reflecting silently on the harsh, undeniable journey of the past year. I had not sought revenge simply for the sake of inflicting cruelty or fulfilling a petty desire to watch them suffer. Cruelty was the exact currency Brenda and Aaron traded in, and I refused to operate on their corrupted level. I had simply initiated a necessary silent adjustment of a broken toxic system. I allowed them the freedom to make their own choices, and they actively chose the path that led to their own total destruction. They were the architects of their own demise. I took 2 heavy ceramic mugs from the cabinet and poured steaming dark black coffee from the carafe. I handed one mug to Simon, the heat transferring comfortably through the thick ceramic. We walked together back out onto the wide cedar balcony. We stood shoulder to shoulder in companionable silence, leaning against the wooden railing, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant canopy of the forest and the distant, towering skyline of the city. The cold wind swept through the trees, carrying the clean scent of rain. The chaos was eradicated. The rot was excised. The order of my life was fully and permanently restored. The world faded into a quiet, absolute black. 6 months passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the wet pavement outside my old apartment. The heavy, suffocating weight of deception that had crushed my chest for a decade was completely gone. I stood on the wide cedar-planked balcony of my new home, breathing in the crisp morning air. The house was not a sprawling, ostentatious estate like the one Brenda had so fiercely guarded. It was a moderately sized, elegantly structured craftsman home nestled quietly in the forested hills just outside the city limits. There were no marble foyers, no imported crystal chandeliers, and absolutely no hollow echoes of simulated affection. The space was filled only with the rich scent of pine, the warmth of natural sunlight, and the profound, absolute serenity of a life completely reclaimed. I looked down at my hands resting on the wooden railing. They no longer trembled with the suppressed anxiety of maintaining a fractured family facade. My physical health had drastically improved, without the constant toxic stress of navigating Aaron's volatile greed and Brenda's endless financial demands. My doctor recently noted my blood pressure was perfect, attributing the remarkable change to a simplified diet and the sudden removal of chronic environmental toxins. The toxic elements in my life had been exclusively human. I watched the wind rustle through the dense canopy of evergreen trees, feeling a deep, resonating vibrancy returning to my bones. The profound isolation I had felt while surrounded by my own flesh and blood had been replaced by a genuine, undeniable peace. I had excised the rotting foundation of my past with surgical precision, leaving only clean, fertile ground to build whatever remained of my future. The silent adjustment I had orchestrated was complete, but the final administrative closure of the old world was arriving this very morning. The sharp crunch of tires on the gravel driveway announced the arrival of Simon, my lead legal counsel, and the steadfast architect of my protective trusts. He stepped out of his modest sedan, carrying a thick, heavily bound leather briefcase. Simon possessed a mind like a steel trap, a man who shared my absolute disdain for unearned arrogance. I walked through the glass patio doors to meet him in the bright, open-concept living room. He did not offer empty pleasantries. He immediately placed a stack of finalized court-certified documents onto the solid oak dining table. He looked up, his expression a mask of professional satisfaction, and delivered the ultimate casualty report of my former family's collapsing empire. Aaron's federal trial had concluded with remarkable speed. Stripped of my financial backing and facing a mountain of undeniable hard-coded forensic evidence regarding his bank fraud and forgery, his expensive defense attorneys had rapidly abandoned him. He was currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary, completely cut off from the luxurious lifestyle he believed was his birthright. Brenda's fate was distinctly different, yet equally absolute. Facing decades of federal incarceration for massive charity embezzlement and aggravated tax evasion, she had broken completely during the initial interrogations. She accepted a brutal ironclad plea agreement orchestrated by the federal prosecutors. She avoided prison by legally binding herself to severe financial restitution. For the next 20 years, the woman who once refused to wear the same designer dress twice was legally mandated to work a strict minimum wage job. Every single dollar she earned above the federal poverty line was to be aggressively garnished and funneled directly back into the philanthropic charity she had so callously plundered. Simon then detailed the international manhunt for Megan. Interpol had successfully extradited her from her attempted offshore sanctuary. She was currently sitting in a federal holding facility without bail, facing a massive labyrinth of international wire fraud charges that guaranteed she would not see the outside of a concrete cell for a very long time. I sat down at the table and carefully reviewed the heavy stack of legal judgments, reading the precise clinical language that officially dissolved the absolute worst mistakes of my life. There was no joy in reading the sentencing reports, nor was there any lingering sorrow. It was simply the necessary, undeniable accounting of debts finally paid in full. I pushed the conviction files aside and pulled the final, most crucial document toward me. This was the ultimate objective of my entire silent campaign. It was not enough to merely neutralize the greed that had infected my family. I needed to permanently secure the capital they had so desperately attempted to steal. I picked up my pen, feeling the smooth, solid weight of the metal between my fingers. The document before me was an irrevocable, ironclad deed of transfer. I signed my name with a steady, deliberate hand, legally moving the absolute entirety of my remaining personal wealth, liquid assets, and private investments into a newly established, highly protected trust. The capital was permanently dedicated to funding a comprehensive, full-ride scholarship program for underprivileged youth in the gritty working-class hometown where I had originally built my logistics business. I was ensuring that the millions of dollars Brenda and Aaron had viewed as their unearned royal inheritance would instead provide education, housing, and genuine opportunity to children who actually understood the profound value of hard work. I legally mandated that the scholarship fund be overseen by an independent rotating board of former logistics employees, guaranteeing that my bloodline could never challenge the trust or access a single cent. My wealth was now entirely detached from my toxic lineage. I placed the pen down on the oak table. The signature was dry and the transfer was instantly binding. My legacy was no longer a towering pile of hoarded cash waiting to be fought over by arrogant vultures. My legacy was a permanent engine of opportunity, completely untouchable and entirely pure. I handed the signed, irrevocable trust documents back to Simon. He carefully secured them inside his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. The legal battlefield was officially cleared. I stood up and walked toward the open kitchen, reflecting silently on the harsh, undeniable journey of the past year. I had not sought revenge simply for the sake of inflicting cruelty or fulfilling a petty desire to watch them suffer. Cruelty was the exact currency Brenda and Aaron traded in, and I refused to operate on their corrupted level. I had simply initiated a necessary silent adjustment of a broken toxic system. I allowed them the freedom to make their own choices, and they actively chose the path that led to their own total destruction. They were the architects of their own demise. I took 2 heavy ceramic mugs from the cabinet and poured steaming dark black coffee from the carafe. I handed one mug to Simon, the heat transferring comfortably through the thick ceramic. We walked together back out onto the wide cedar balcony. We stood shoulder to shoulder in companionable silence, leaning against the wooden railing, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant canopy of the forest and the distant towering skyline of the city. The cold wind swept through the trees, carrying the clean scent of rain. The chaos was eradicated. The rot was excised. The order of my life was fully and permanently restored. The world faded into a quiet, absolute black. True power does not reside in the volume of your anger or the cruelty of your retaliation. It lives in the quiet preservation of your boundaries and the refusal to let toxic greed dictate your existence. When you remove financial support, you immediately expose the hollow foundation of entitlement. Walking away from those who view your love as a transactional resource is not a defeat. It is an absolute act of personal protection. Real wealth is never defined by hoarded assets, but by the undeniable peace that arrives when you finally reclaim your dignity and unconditionally protect your own mind. Share your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories, and let us know what actions you would have taken in Eugene's position.